Okay, folks, if you could take your seat, we can start this last session before lunch. After the session, there'll just be a short break. You can get up and stretch, but lunch is going to be served at the tables that you're already at, so you can stay in the same place, but as I say, you may want to get up and stretch your legs. This next panel is on renewable energy, an area I think where Latin American countries have great potential, depending, of course, on the future price of oil. We have two speakers, Juan Pablo Bonilla from the Inter-American Development Bank, and Brent de Jong, founder and vice chairman of the Ashmore Energy International. So I guess you would start first.
Is the presentation okay? Good. Okay. Good morning. Still, first of all, thanks to all the organizers for this invitation, to the Inter-American Development Bank for being here. As you saw Ramon's presentation in the morning, the first session about petroleum, about the situation of Venezuela. We are going to try to complement with this presentation the other part of the equation regarding sustainable energy and climate change. From the IDB's perspective, and that's why it's very important to be here at the Bakers Institute today, we see the whole picture of sustainable energy and climate change as one of the key factors for the relationship based on a partnership between the U.S., Latin America, and the Caribbean in the next years. Hopefully, we will see in the next 10 years more headlines in the Washington Post and the other media of the U.S. talking not about drugs, immigration, but talking about a partnership towards sustainable energy and climate change, U.S. and our region. And I'm gonna figure out first how to pass the presentation. Right here. So right there? Okay. Oh, thank you.
Is it there? I think it's there.
I think it's there. Okay, good.
Is it there?
Thank you. Right.
Very good.
Okay. And the title of the presentation is Outlook for Alternative Energy, and I'm going to refer to both sustainable energy and climate change. But I would like to start saying that energy and climate change as a challenge for the Latin American and the Caribbean region, we have right now as a region a twin dilemma. The first one, we need to boost our economy based on the energy consumption, and we have a need from the poverty point of view also to have more electricity. About 10% of the population of our region doesn't have electricity. The energy demand in LAC will increase about 75% by 2030. And the estimate is that we will require about $1,600 billion of investments. Achieving sustainability of energy supply and rational use of energy resources is going to be the key. After the presentation that you saw before, the whole question is how to mix the energy security component, which is going to be key for the whole region, and as was very good outlined, is more South American issue. We have to first solve many issues from the political point of view in countries like Argentina, like Brazil, like Colombia, like Venezuela. But at the same time, we have the whole challenge of having the diversification gradually of the energy matrix and how that is related to climate change. The expected impacts of climate change in the region, and I wanted to introduce that variable because it's strongly linked. If you saw one of the presentations before ours, the hydro component into the Latin American matrix is very important. Not only in Brazil, Paraguay, of course, Colombia, Peru, Bolivia, many other countries, and they are already facing the impacts of climate change. I came back last week from Peru and Bolivia, and there is already some warning if the hydros, Colombia too, will have enough water in the next 10 to 15 years. To do that, and not just have estimates considering climate change, probability, certainty, and uncertainty, the IDB is already working with NCAR, with the National Center for Atmospheric Research of the United States in Boulder, to use their modeling, their computers, to assess that vulnerability. In Peru, we're going to start assessing, for example, the water supply for an irrigation project in the northwest part of Peru, with Empresas Públicas de Medellín to define the whole methodology to assess climate change impact on the hydro system of Colombia. So I wanted to bring particularly that part, because if you consider the matrix, in general, Latin America has had a clean matrix during the last years. If you take what you saw about oil and you go to particularly power generation, the hydro component has been fundamental. But if you put right now the financial crisis and the need that we need for power generation in the next years, you're seeing how the matrix will maybe change from diversification from hydro to other sources. Hopefully renewables, but if you see what is happening in practice due to the crisis, is a switch to coal. Minister Togman from Chile was at the IDB last week, and Chile is turning to coal. Colombia is we have very good coal in Colombia, so we're using it. It's, of course, a very important resource. But if you see other countries, we just received some proposals to finance coal-fired plants in Brazil, in Guatemala, in Panama. So the urgency of power generation plus diversification of hydro due to climate change impacts, plus the financial crisis, is posing a huge and tremendous challenge. And I'm going to start mixing everything into the sustainable energy picture. If you see the oil stocks, to add to the matrix of the region, and if you see this balance, this is Ramon's figures, you just see that in North America, we have a decrease of the stocks, and in general terms, South America have had an increase, particularly in the Andean countries, particularly in Venezuela. But if to that figure you add what Ramon presented, the decrease in productivity of PDVSA plus the increase of consumption internally, what we see for the Western Hemisphere right now is that the total consumption based on production, we have at least 1/3 of imports, primarily to the United States. So if the main source here is not the Andean countries, it's coming from other sources, the question is how in the future, particularly for the Western Hemisphere as a whole, and for our countries, we're going to solve the issue of sustainable energy, increase energy production, but at the same time, diversifying the energy matrix. And there is a key issue here, which is energy efficiency. The ADB our bank made a report last year in September that was released in Sao Paulo about energy efficiency. And we showed some pictures showing that there is about $50 billion of direct subsidies to fuel consumption in Latin America. That is, to have an idea, 5 times what the IDB lends to the region per year for all the sectors. And the question was, what if, considering the financial crisis, we start using some of that subsidies for energy efficiency measures? And a key example is Mexico. Mexico has a very comprehensive strategy right now for energy efficiency. The IDB has the first energy efficiency loan for the FIDE, the Fideicomiso de Eficiencia Energética de México, and the results were amazing. It was a $50 million loan that the final results were equivalent not to have a 280 megawatt thermal power plant. It was a 1-to-5 savings. So if we see the matrix, and that's why I think this next picture is very important. Okay. You see the importance of hydro. And the first one, going from bottom to top, is coal. Then we have oil, gas, nuclear is the small yellow. Then we have hydro. And finally, we have combined renewables and waste and geothermal. Energy efficiency is not yet in these figures, and we have to include it in order to be sustainable in the next years. Gradually include renewables. Oil, of course, will continuing to be a very important part in the energy matrix. Coal also will have a very important component. By the way, if you see the Nicholas Stern report about climate change, Nicholas Stern is very punctually saying that coal will be a very important fossil fuel in the next 50 years in terms of energy security, but that the whole challenge is carbon capture, storage, and carbon technology. Projects like FutureGen and others initiatives that European countries with the US, China, etc., has to prove will be the key for using in a sustainable way fossil fuels like coal in the future. So the IDB's response to all this issue has been the SECI, the Sustainable Energy and Climate Change Initiative. Although it was a very recent initiative, it was a bank-wide effort to respond to the clean energy, to the international clean energy framework. And we have 4 pillars: renewable energy, energy efficiency, sustainable bioenergy, carbon financing, and climate change adaptation. I just wanted to show this picture because in less than a year and a half, we have been able to have about 80 technical cooperations right now to help countries in Latin America start developing their institutional and regulatory frameworks to renewable energy, energy efficiency, biofuels, and more than $1 billion in loans that I'm going to just show you some of the examples of what we're doing. And if you see in the bottom, the PBLs are policy-based loans that we're starting in 3 or 4 countries to define that agenda, because without that, it is not going to be possible for the private sector to come and invest. A very good example is what we're doing in Chile with the National Program for Energy Efficiency. In Panama, we're starting the wind mapping for Panama, as well as in Costa Rica, the support for the National Energy Efficiency Law in Panama. And Mexico, that I will refer later, is the best example of that comprehensive approach. Just internally, SECI has been put as a transversal issue. It's not energy, it's not environment, it has to deal with all the sectors involved: energy, transport, water, sanitation, agriculture. And more or less what the countries in the region are asking the IDB is to help also to create the architectural arrangement internally to have the same approach. And I wanted to talk about the climate investment funds. I don't know if you are familiar, they are very new. The climate investment funds were just approved in October last year. We're going to have 2 funds managed by the CIF unit at the World Bank, but implemented jointly by the World Bank with the other regional banks. We have a pledge of about $6 billion right now. The main contributors are UK, the US, and Japan. And those 2 funds, particularly the second one in the picture, the Clean Technology Fund, will be directed to sustainable energy projects, pilot projects, that can show replication and scale-up results. The first example that we had in the region was the Mexico investment plan. How the CIF works: we have to go together, the regional banks with the World Bank, and with the governments made an investment plan. We just finished the one for Mexico, and we presented $500 million for Mexico to support 2 pilot projects. The first one is sustainable transport, particularly BRTs, and the second one is renewable energy and energy efficiency. We're going to try to have a pilot of renewable energy wind, a wind maybe 200, 250 megawatts in Oaxaca. The idea of the CIF is to cover the incremental cost. Of course, wind projects right now, the cost of generation is still higher than, for example, hydro or others like coal and diesel. So the idea is that the CIF will cover that differential cost to make that technology feasible. It's a pilot issue. It's a transitional instrument towards the post-Kyoto regime. The idea is to show how the CIF will work for mitigation and adaptation. The key part will be mitigation. The next steps will be right now to produce the investment plan for Brazil for $750 million, and maybe for Colombia and Peru for about 150 or 200. The key issue here is that the focal points of the CIF at the country level are not the ministers of environment or energy or transport, are the ministers of treasury. So we're working with them to really include this concessional funding. The CIF money's concessional funding is about 40 years period with 20 years of grace period to make this investment possible. And the idea is based on those pilots, then show the replication possibility and the scaling up for the region as a whole. The adaptation or resilience component is smaller from the CIF. It will be about $1 billion to do some pilots of adaptation. What are these pilots? For example, in Peru, we were seeing the impact of climate change in agriculture, particularly for small communities. And the idea is to create pilot projects for communities in rural areas to adapt to those changes. For that part, we're going to have just $100 million for the region to maybe 2 pilots, one in Peru and the other one will be in the Caribbean, Haiti, and 2 more countries. And I just referred to the policy-based programs, Mexico and Colombia. We're going to start one additional in Peru and maybe one in Uruguay to help the countries create that mainstreaming of climate change and renewable energy. The one in Mexico is a very good example. We just included the new renewable energy law of Mexico. It's a region-wide example. It's the first country in Latin America having a renewable energy law. It was approved in November, last week of November last year. That includes a transitional financing sustainable energy fund to start developing new energy programs for Mexico. So when I mention all the CIF pilot for Mexico, the idea is that that pilot will serve as an input for the new transition law to start supporting renewables. And the law, for example, is including very important issues. The first one is the externalities. The Mexican government right now needs to quantify the externalities, positive for renewables, negative for the others, and regionally start assessing the potential for renewables in the different regions of Mexico, not only wind, solar, geothermal, even algae. There is in Sonora already a biodiesel algae program following some pilots like the one of Green Fuels in Arizona to capture CO2 and feed the algae with that and produce biodiesel. So Mexico is really moving the agenda based on a key issue. It's a state policy directly from the President of Mexico. President Calderon has taken this as a key issue for the government and is including the National Program of Climate Change, the PEC, as a national priority. I'm just saying this because I see Mexico as a key partner for the US. I just saw the news last night that President Obama will present as part of the budget package the auction of pollution allowances for CO2 as a revenue income, and Mexico will be a great partner for the US to start having a cap and trade system. There is already a very good base, which is the 1605 article of the Clean Air Act of the US that allows for voluntary emission reporting. But Mexico, not only the Baja California and the others, will be a key partner, thinking in a good partnership towards that. Texas, when I show the picture about what we have done in the last year and a half, I just wanted to show you 2 examples. The first one is Texas. When we received the request for a technical cooperation of SECI at the ADB to do the wind assessment potential for the region and overseas for a Brazilian company, many people were saying, is that possible or not? And Texas, 20 minutes from Sao Paulo, has become one of the key wind blades producers right now. The ADB approved very recently a $120 million corporate loan to support Texas based on that technical cooperation. And LACFIN, this went to the ADB board a couple of weeks ago, is an energy efficiency facility for $150 million to support, is not for a greenfield projects, is to support existing biofuel plants in 7 countries of the region to do cogeneration, to do energy efficiency and cogeneration. So I just wanted to show it as another pilot example that we're doing region-wide. And finally, and to end my presentation, is the importance of sustainability. As you read in the news, biofuels received a lot of critics last year. We do believe in the IDB that biofuels needs to be part of the energy matrix of LAC, not only for Brazil, which is a great example, but also what Colombia has shown in the last 5 years, what other countries of Central America, for example, are doing is essential, but we need to do it right. We need to do it in a sustainable way. So as in the ADB, we developed the Sustainability Scorecard. It's an internal instrument to screen biofuel projects. We are already using the scorecard for evaluating about 40 projects in the region. And the most important part is that the governments are very interested in starting using the instrument. Peru is going to start using the scorecard, and we're going to Argentina in 3 weeks. And last week, the team went to Colombia to start using the scorecard there. So I wanted to finish with the scorecard because the sustainability board, I think, has a huge and tremendous message. We do need to improve our energy security. I'm talking about Latin America and the Caribbean and their relationship with the US, but we need to include, since the beginning, the climate change variable to really has sustainability as a key issue for that agenda. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Juan Pablo. Well, the presentation's coming up. Just, I want to share with you, really echoing a lot of the thoughts that Juan Pablo has shared, but really try to bring it a little bit more down on a per-country basis in terms of some of the specifics that are facing and the opportunities and challenges facing the various countries. Maybe just to start with a little bit of background about AEI, the company that I set up 3 years ago, just so you can understand the perspective of which I've been looking at these issues. AEI is a global emerging market infrastructure business, but we have a very strong presence in Latin America. About 85% of our revenue and assets come from Latin America today. As you can see here on the next line, we have today 39 businesses in 20 countries, about 15,000 employees and 6.6 million customers that we've acquired and put together over the last several years. And it's a mix of businesses, so we see a lot of the value chain, whether that's power distribution, power production, natural gas transportation, natural gas distribution, and we even have retail fuel. Perhaps maybe not quite this core for us today, but it's part of the business that we've evolved as we've grown. And you can see with some of the volumes that we touch upon that we have, we face, really all parts of the regulation, of the regulatory regimes, of the power production, and we see all fuel mixes as we have been building out this business. Really, maybe just taking a step back and talking about, setting the context for renewables on very much a global stage, because I think this is quite important. It's important to understand and remember Latin America, frankly, is a follower in a lot of respects for the rest of the world, just simply because of the size. When you look at global electric generation, coal, and to the lesser extent natural gas, will by far dominate the net adds over the next years. Because we focus on global emerging markets, one of the statistics that I share with you is that we need about 80 gigawatts a year within the global emerging markets to be added just to meet the growth on a sustainable basis. The only practical way to do that today, frankly, is through coal. Because of the cost, and we'll walk through some of the cost of that, because of the scale in terms of putting large production into work, and frankly also time to market compared to, for example, large hydros and some of the others. So the biggest way on a kind of a global perspective that we can have an impact on climate change is pushing clean coal technology. And so, given that Latin America is smaller and is a follower, if China, if the US, if India, if these markets, which are much larger users, can produce clean coal, therefore Latin America could be a beneficiary of that as well. To give you an idea, I was in China just the last 2 weeks, and in China they added 80 gigawatts just in China last year, of which they shut down 60 gigawatts, so the net add was 20 gigawatts. And basically what they're doing is they're displacing all the smaller, less efficient plants, So yeah, energy efficiency, also having larger plants, you can amortize your costs for your environmental equipment on a much greater basis, and it's much more cost effective. So as we kind of move forward, you see that is going to be the driver. India was very similar. I spent some time there as well. To give you an idea in terms of production scale, I was going through Suzlon's plants in India, and they're embarking upon a 40% increase on production capacity. But their still annual production capacity is going to be 7,000 megawatts and of wind. They're the third largest, depending on how you measure it, wind turbine generator in the world today. So, to build the scale, you need an entire industry, and for the renewables to kind of adjust in order to really for renewables to be any significant size of the global footprint. And I think that's true also for Latin America. I agree with Juan Pablo. Latin America is beginning, or is today, at a very good position from a renewable basis, simply because of the hydroelectric. Well, roughly 2/3 of the production is hydroelectric in Latin America, whereas 2/3 of the production globally is thermal. So just that alone is a very different balance and kind of sets that up. But also, you've heard some of the trends that there has been strong growth in thermal, given the variability of the water, as well as, frankly, there hasn't been good long-term planning. Hydro takes longer to build than a lot of, for example, combined cycle could be. A simple open cycle can be put up in 12 months if you're really aggressive, whereas a combined cycle could be a couple years. Coal, 3 to 4 years, and really some of the hydro projects are 5 to 10 years in a lot of instances. So given that there wasn't long-term planning in a lot of ways, plus the vulnerability to the variability of water, thermal has become quite an important part of the energy production chain in Latin America. And you've seen a few of these graphs, but just, of South America, Brazil is by far the leader of about 84% of the production of electric generation production being hydro, and 4% from renewables. That's changing, and I'll touch base on that on a couple of slides later. But the low price of natural gas throughout the continent is a big issue to focus on. For example, Peru, Bolivia, Argentina, there's a lot of countries in the continent that have very low natural gas prices. As part of that result, hydro is not as profitable in terms of investment as, per se, some of the gas-fired plants. So you have a mix where actually hydro is not incentivized today, because gas prices have been kept low, whether that's because of specific policy issues, which frankly were needed in the early part of the decade or late 90s to have the energy sustainability or stability to offset some of the hydro issues in terms of variability of water. But today it's creating a distortion in the market. And some of that's for legacy policy issues, which I think were quite intelligent. In other cases, it's very populist driven today. Argentina, of course, as talked about previously, stands out with a very high amount of natural gas. In Central America, Costa Rica stands out with some 94% of its sources of renewable, and they actually have a goal starting in 2010 to be 100% renewable. And of course, Costa Rica takes on a very interesting kind of green tourism, and there's a very nationalistic pride, and they can see the benefits beyond just for the altruistic nature of reducing the carbon output. But some of the other Latin American countries are really struggling because these are marginal cost systems where the next least efficient plant that comes into the system will set the marginal cost for the entire system. As a result of that, costs have skyrocketed of energy prices across Central America on a whole. And so, Central America is experiencing something, and that this actually is starting to create a basis of which renewable energy actually is cost competitive in Central America, where you don't necessarily need significant policies in order to be able to build out some of the renewable technologies. Just to remind you, and this may be a bit difficult to read, but the capital costs on the left, you have coal, and you have the combined cycle gas technology. Actually, from a capital cost and an operating cost perspective, on a combined basis, coal still is by far the most competitive. The gas, these are global numbers, and you can see on a global basis, gas often is very expensive. However, as we talked about in Latin America, gas is often a subsidized or a price cap. So from that perspective, gas actually is very, very competitive in Latin America as well. You can see solar stands out as very, very high. I think that's something to watch on a global basis. As solar starts to get scale, the capital costs should come down substantially as volume and scale up from the production side. But you can see why renewables often need a policy initiative in order to be incentivized in the countries. Just to look at Latin America in the context of the CO2 emissions, really the three largest CO2 countries out of Latin America are Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina. Brazil largely is because of the deforestation. As opposed to the energy mix. We talked about the very large amount of hydro being there. So that's a little bit different. But you can see also on the right there, the actual emissions that come from the various sources or technologies. Coal being by far the highest. However, you see the darker blue line, and that's kind of clean coal, where that's kind of the goal of a lot of people to move towards. Gas is the second highest, and then biomass, and then working down. And that's just the facts that we're facing today. Of the kind of the different types of technology, hydro, you can see Brazil's in the top 3 in the world. And then you have a vast number of countries throughout Latin America that rank very well. Geothermal, actually all of these countries are in the top 10, except for Argentina. So Central America is within the top 10 and compares very well. I think there's actually a lot of geothermal, particularly in Nicaragua, that has been unexplored. Guatemala to a lesser extent. El Salvador and Costa Rica, of course, which are leading. Wind has been by far the smallest of the technologies throughout all of South America. And that's, I think, largely because hydro's been so prevalent. You had bioethanol, which has been a cheaper way in order to introduce the aspect of renewable energy. And I think bioethanol, you'll see, will become more significant as well throughout time. Maybe just taking one of the technologies, wind. Our first investment in wind was in Nicaragua. We've built a 40-megawatt wind farm there. And what was interesting thing here is just walk through why did we see it from a value proposition. One was we were able to achieve a long-term PPA with the Spanish-owned distribution company. There we actually are expecting efficiency factors of 40–45%, which is extremely high for wind. And then, of course, in Nicaragua is probably one of the least efficient from the senses they're using very old fuel oil, very simple cycle, low speed piston engines that are just setting the marginal price. So we could actually come in here with a very high efficiency factor We were supported by the Central American Development Bank in terms of a kind of policy loan, and we were able to get carbon credits. And so we're actually able to have a very positive economic return in a very high cost of equity or type of country. And you can see there's a kind of a convergence of factors that gave us the confidence to make that investment. Maybe just touching base on one of the other fuel sources, biofuels, and using Brazil as an example. Of course, I think you have to go there given the size. And really, Brazil on the whole, in terms of its entire energy mix of only being roughly 40% of oil, is actually a very solid or very good energy mix on the whole. However, I think you'll see ethanol as well as other sources helping reduce the dependence on oil. The other phenomenon you have going on is compressed natural gas, and we can talk about that in a minute. But to give you an idea, in Brazil, while hydro may be cheap, the reality is that it's working on a pooled auction basis, in the sense there's a kind of a central clearinghouse that sets the rules for energy auctions. So for example, one of the energy auctions that was recently occurred was really focused on biomass and particularly bagasse type cogeneration type production. In that auction in late 2008, 2,400 megawatts were sold into that. We're seeing similar type of auctions being coming on board with Brazil, in the sense their wind auction will come up. So while the hydro exists, because it is a central pooled function, is that the regulators can have some direction and input in really maintaining balance of the system on a whole. And we see, while 2007, 2008 in the bottom graph here was only 1.8 gigawatts, we expect, just because of the 2.4 that was sold in late 2008, this to grow to over 14 gigawatts of production over the next 10 to 12 years. One of the companies that I'm involved in is a company called Brenco in Brazil. This is outside of AEI. But just to give you a little bit more specifics on ethanol and why this is quite an interesting topic. Brenco, we've started production on 4 plants, but in total we're looking to build 12 plants. We would be exporting roughly 1 to 1.2 billion gallons of ethanol a year. And so you can have projects of scale. The difference, maybe some in the audience are more familiar with corn ethanol here in the US. For every kilojoule of energy that you put in, you get roughly 1.5 to 2 kilojoules of energy out. Whereas with ethanol and sugarcane, based ethanol in Brazil, we're getting roughly 9 units of energy out for every unit of energy in. So there's a real kind of science and reason and to the investment, and we're one of many. But you can see the scale of which ethanol will be, and this frankly was largely we were able to achieve the size because of funding that was available from the BNDES. We closed the 1.2 billion rice funding in order to help build out or help finance the build out of the first 4 plants. I think this is, it's worthwhile touching base on compressed natural gas. With kind of some of the pricing distortions, compressed natural gas is growing, and this is something that was going to be quite important in terms of, because the CO2 emissions are a lot less on compressed natural gas. We've talked about energy independence or energy security, pricing, legislation, and public perception really are the drivers, and we can spend a lot of time talking about that. And I know that we probably need to move on to some of the questions and answers period. So.
Thank you. Well, we are running a little late for lunch, but I'm sure we have time for a couple of questions. questions?
Nobody is. I would like to ask a question to our renewable experts. We have been talking about renewable energy sources for such a long time, in case Brazil is a leader about it. And we feel that it is very, very important. But any forecast you look at it, it is likely to meet at best 5 or 6% by 2030. And we talk about renewable. Are we really kidding ourselves? Can we do something about it? Can we think some out-of-the-box type of solution, like if we are really serious about climate change, and if we are really serious about energy security and others, is this the way to proceed? What can we do? Why is that renewable energy has still not met the goal we thought it should meet? After the first 2 oil shocks, we said there is a race to replace, but we forgot. Now the 3rd oil shock came and we are almost forgetting it. You gave the example of Suzlon. It's not doing all that great now. Its stock prices are so low. It was doing so great. So can we really try to find out what is that we really need to do if we are really serious about replacing hydrocarbons?
It's a very good question. And that was exactly the question that leaders tried to address in Davos. Because if you go a year and a half ago, with the prices of oil in 145 or higher, and the recent reports of climate change, with that there was a huge, I think, worldwide position to incentive renewables. Right now, with the price of the oil and the crisis, the whole question mark is how are we make renewables and sustainable energy more than a good idea reality? More or less is your question. And I really agree with the way different leaders put this, the crisis and opportunity to see both energy security and climate change as an opportunity to rethink a model of growth for developed and developing countries. What Brent just showed in China is a very good example. China is working a lot right now on energy efficiency, on renewables. What India is doing is also a very good example. And the US has very good initiatives in both areas. But of course, you're going to need to rethink the way of doing, the whole model of growth. And if you include countries like Brazil, Mexico, the biggest emitters in our region, that is going to be needed. Technology is helping a lot. And I'm quite impressed when you come from a developing country to see how fast developing is moving. If you see, I strongly believe in second-generation biofuels to be viable maybe in the next 5 years. And the way they are moving. If you see what the US is right now doing in technology development as well as Brazil, I think they are going very fast. Even there was a very good question this morning about Petrobras. Petrobras is investing a lot in biofuels. It's partnering with Ecopetrol in Colombia, with other petroleum companies. I think we're not going to have any more petroleum companies in the future. We're going to have sustainable energy companies. And you see how many petroleum companies are becoming that, are becoming companies of energy. And of course, the technology is going to be key, but still, we're going to need some time. The capital cost, as Brent showed, of solar is still very high. But it's incredible how wind has improved in the last maybe 5-7 years. I think no one, couple of years, could have been able to forecast the cost of wind right now and how wind in some areas is becoming competitive. Now, from the economic point of view, if you reflect the real price of fuels, particularly gasoline, the figures that Ramon showed in Venezuela, last year when I saw the whole critics about subsidies of biofuels in Brazil, for example, and the subsidies of the European Union for wind, I was wondering, who's going to mention what are the subsidies for gasoline consumption? That's why I started my presentation with the 50 billion figure for the region. So if you're able to reflect the real price of gasoline, including the externalities of climate change, I think that will be a key signal to be able to make renewables possible in the next 20 years.
No, I think, as I mentioned before, the technology change will come, and that won't be driven by Latin America. I think that Latin America, though, has a lot that it can do, in the sense, for example, it can displace oil with compressed natural gas. You've seen it in Colombia, Argentina, in a number of countries where compressed natural gas is the choice for the vehicle fleets. You have ethanol in Brazil. So there are a number of ways, continuing kind of long-term planning and incentivizing continued construction of hydro. There's a lot of hydro. While there's water risk, there's a lot of hydro work that can be done. You can build more towards the Atlantic and less towards the Pacific in order to balance that out. There's a lot of kind of additional hydros that can be added downriver, and that's not going to impact neither the streams nor, frankly, undermine the variability of water. So I think that there are a phenomenal number of policy tools that within Latin America itself that can just continue to focus on, if not reducing the carbon footprint, but making sure that each additional kilojoule of energy used has a less of a carbon footprint than it does today. And so, I think that's really, as a region, that's what should be focused on.
I think we ought to stop here since we are running about a half an hour late. At this point.